Honored guests, respected friends, again, it's an honor and a joy to be here with you at the 2019 Global Symposium. This gathering is about solutions. It's about hope. It's about coming together in a spirit of partnership to contemplate some very big questions. What does it mean to belong? How do we build belonging in our world? How can we reimagine and reawaken community in this age of so much isolation and fragmentation? I've been on a journey to answer these questions for the past 20 years. The purpose of this global symposium is to walk together on this journey, to work together toward answering these questions in partnership. What makes this symposium different from many gatherings is that it's not about experts and listeners, teachers and students, and followers and leaders. There is nothing prescriptive here. When it comes to the work of building belonging in our world, each one of us is as much an expert as anyone else. My hope for the coming days is that we can join together in openness, in the spirit of creativity and service, to build our understanding and generate positive momentum. 5 years ago, in the fall of 2014, many of us met here in Toronto for the first Global Symposium. It was the start of an intensive process of visioning, problem-solving, and collaboration among a richly diverse group of advocates, activists, scholars, dreamers, and educators. People from conflict zones who have been forced to migrate from their homes. Indigenous peoples who have suffered direct consequences of the abuse of nature. People across continents overcoming indignities of racism, sexism, ageism, and prejudice against disability. Through our shared contemplation and work, I've come to a steadily increasing conviction that the issue is much bigger than what we typically call social isolation or the lack of social connectedness. I've seen that the answer to the challenge is not only connection to people, but also connection to place, connection to power, and connection to purpose. There is one word that describes the multifaceted kind of connection that can heal what's ailing us as a human family in the 21st century. That word is belonging. Belonging is a state of wholeness, the experience of being at home in the social, environmental, organizational, and cultural contexts of one's life. Belonging is beloved community, rootedness in a place, a feeling of ownership in shared outcomes, and a sense of shared mission. It's not just human contact, it's care. Belonging, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is to be in the right place. It's the experience of being at home. It is possible to be in the right place, to be at home in one's own body, in one's family, in one's community, in one's country, on our planet as a whole. Belonging is the well-being that comes from being a part of something greater than the unexamined impulses of the ego or separate self. Belonging is a psychological security that frees us to generously give our gifts to the world and to graciously receive the gifts that the world has to offer us in return. I love the Celtic mystic John O'Donohue. The way he describes it is, belonging is our longing to be in a state of wholeness. Belonging is a deep desire to live in respect, recognition, and reciprocity with other people and with the planet. It is not just an abstract, high-minded philosophical idea, and it's certainly not an exciting new innovation in psychology or social development. Belonging is our birthright. Belonging is a state of being toward which we are all inherently entitled. All human beings, by simple virtue of the fact that they were born, have the right to belong. There's a practical way I think about the meaning of belonging. It's our connection to the 4 P's: people, place, power, and purpose. First, belonging is connection to people. It's human connectedness, including face-to-face relationships, grounded not only in mutual interest but also in care. Simple human interaction is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Building belonging requires active recognition of the inherent worth of each and every human being, starting within one's own self. Second, belonging is connection to place. Having a home should mean having a sanctuary, a place of safety where you can be understood by others, where it is possible to be honest and present, where you don't have to wear any masks. When we feel a sense of belonging in a physical place or a natural ecosystem, we feel intuitive commitment to preserve it and to honor it. Third, belonging is connection to power. It's our capacity to contribute to help shape our circumstances, to give our gifts to the world. Belonging isn't just a passive state. We can cultivate our belonging in a neighborhood by volunteering, starting a socially minded business, or simply practicing day-to-day acts of empathy. We can grow our belonging within a society by helping to steer its course and shape its culture, whether by creating art or sharing ideas or participating in the political process. It's empowerment, not just power, empowerment. It starts within, and it extends to multiple levels of partnership and community. It's a circle of reciprocity. The gifts we give come back to us. Fourth, belonging is connection to purpose. For a person to have the rich experience of being in the right place, it's naturally important to have a sense of our context, a perspective on why we're here, where we should be headed, and what's right and good. This doesn't necessarily need to be about religion. We have traditionally defined it in one way. Here, we simply mean that we all need a vital sense of why. A person can find belonging by encountering a calling or an ethical orientation that drives empathy and connection. I know we're so far from this reality in our world today. When I think about all the defining issues of the 21st century, environmental degradation, mental illness, economic alienation, the shortage of shared purpose, the decline of rich community life, I think of how all of these pertain to our experience of belonging. As you all know so well, the problems of this era are painfully real. There are more forced migrants fleeing their homes today than any time since World War II. Our environment is in an unmatched state of vulnerability. Young people around the world are facing an unprecedented level of depression and anxiety and a shortage of jobs. There's a veritable epidemic of loneliness in societies all around the world. According to a 2019 Gallup study of 151,000 people in more than 140 countries, negative emotions, including worry, anger, sadness, and stress, are now at their highest recorded levels. And yet I mean it when I say this is a gathering about hope. There is a way forward. This way forward, I believe, is a global agenda to restore our connection to people, place, purpose, and power. The path forward is to enshrine our right to belong. To imagine a global agenda, we should first take a step back. What does it really mean that belonging is our birthright? What does it mean that belonging is both a new and ancient value? Well, it's hard to make any sweeping claims about humanity's past. There are plenty of indications that our ancient lives were oriented toward at least a basic sense of belonging. This is not to say that the old days were perfect, far from it. But even if we were insecure or poor, or even less free, more people in earlier eras of human history probably had at least some basic feeling of connection and rootedness. My belief is that we can preserve what's been won while recovering what's been lost. To understand this more, let's take a very brief look at the history of human belonging. The brilliant historian Yuval Noah Harari has argued that human beings primarily lived through most of history in groups of about 150 people or less, where hunter-gatherer or foraging tribes or small settlements were the norm. Modern sociological research shows that this is about the maximum natural size of a community in which it's possible to know everyone intimately. To transcend this small scale, a group usually needs to go beyond direct face-to-face human contact and rely on formal systems to promote law and other forms of order, and as well as to generate communication and caring communities. Throughout most of human history, we also generally lived within a relatively small radius of the places where we were born. We experienced rootedness in a particular physical space, especially before the agricultural revolution. Most societies probably saw themselves as embedded within nature. Our ecosystems were central to our experience of life. Finally, there's evidence in our past that we largely lived in common cultural contexts. We shared fundamental stories or myths about the meaning of human existence and the requirements of a good and moral life. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have transformed all these realities. We largely moved to big cities. We became increasingly divorced from nature on a day-to-day basis. We started working in factories and shops and offices where we became interchangeable pieces of a bigger and bigger economic machine. And we largely embraced a philosophy of scientific empiricism that disposed of traditional myth and meaning and faith. Over the past couple centuries, we've seen a steady rise in the importance of the individual and the decline of the small community. Today, many of our most important aspects of human relations are embedded in an economy or larger society rather than community or kin. It's essential that we maintain the progress that we've made in terms of women's liberation, democratization, free speech, LGBT rights, choice in marriage and livelihood and location, reductions in racism, as well as the gains we've made in human living standards, progress against poverty, and technological advancement, including information technologies that have enabled a global marketplace of ideas. And yet, I'm convinced that we can and must restore the sense of connection and rootedness that's so threatened in the 21st century. While we continue to make progress in terms of individual liberty, technology, and economic development, we need to elevate a value that's been central to human life since time immemorial. We need to restore our right to belong. Solving the challenges of the 21st century will require a paradigm shift, what the Reverend Martin Luther King called a revolution in values. This revolution means a range of practical policy reforms, programs, and innovations. However, the start of this revolution is contemplation. It begins with a four-word question that might sound utterly simple, but is essential to shaping our future. What do we value? What is it that we, as human beings at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, prize and prioritize in our cultures, legal systems, and governance? What are the underlying principles that drive our policies and markets and media? What are the values that we've enshrined in our society, whether implicitly or explicitly, that will define our future? Looking at the world today, it's clear that on the whole, we tend to value individual liberty and technological progress and economic growth. And looking at the world today, I think we're largely marching forward on these matters. But we need to reawaken the value on which we're currently regressing. It's the value that I believe is most intrinsic to our well-being. That value is belonging. So let's talk specifically about our work ahead. What will the right to belong actually look like in practice? How can we elevate belonging as a value? How can we enshrine belonging as an inalienable and universal right? These are the central questions we'll be contemplating in the coming days. They're questions we'll be answering together through diverse perspectives from people from different sectors and continents and points of view. The right to belong, I believe, can take the form of a charter, of a repository of ideas, an ongoing global dialogue. It can mean a combination of concrete and enforceable legal rules, standards, and guidelines for national governments, and moral principles to inspire action around the world. Let's focus a sharp lens on concrete legal rights. There are upward of 230 million children under 5 today, mostly ethnic minorities or families living in extreme poverty, who lack birth certificates or other birth records simply because their governments will not or cannot count them. They lack a meaningful claim to having a home. In the most literal sense, they do not belong. Let's add stateless people to that too. One straightforward legal element of the right to belong, for example, is to realize the right of every person to birth registration. Likewise, the legal vision will require strengthening the rights of Indigenous peoples to live on their lands, speak their languages, and practice their rituals and educate their children. The right to belong means action to enforce and enhance the legal mechanisms that defend human connection in the sense of people, place, power, and purpose. And the right to belong will require a social and economic element. This goes beyond what might classify as a right in the formal sense of strict legal enforceability. Rather, it is a sense of building a set of visionary principles to guide policy agendas around the world. Just as the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights sets forth ambitious principles to guide the policies of governments around the world, including rights to food and adequate housing, the right to belong can include a constellation of goals, best practices, and standards to steer policy actions. For example, the right to belong could guide governments to ensure that no older person be allowed to languish alone. This, in turn, could mean government policies and programs to promote intergenerational living centers, new rules and oversights to regulate institutional settings, and new funding for national service programs that enrich the lives of older persons. In short, the right to belong can be a global framework to guide national and local policy, and also recognize all of the rights that are already in place that we've kind of forgot about. We need to remember what we know. Finally, perhaps most importantly, the right to belong should be a moral vision that inspires and informs a social movement. This means finding ways to enhance our connection and rootedness through business decision-making, NGO advocacy, organizational design, education, urban planning, and local activism. Ultimately, we can't legislate belonging. It requires deep personal and cultural change. It means new rituals, new ways of communicating, models of structuring workplaces and health systems and schools, Building the right to belong will be a bottom-up effort. In the days ahead, we will explore the legal, social, and economic elements of the right to belong. And yet, this symposium is fundamentally about moral vision. It's about an opening, evolving, non-hierarchical movement that will make this revolution in values real. This is where the movement starts. This is where we envision, strategize, and lean into the change. That's what this symposium is about. We will together imagine a new charter for belonging, the principles we should enshrine globally and locally to restore our connection and rootedness. Together, we'll imagine the forums in which people from around the world can come together, as they did 75 years ago in the process of developing the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to imagine these new principles for building belonging in the world today. We will envision and work towards systemic change, including in our economy. Right now, as a global society, we're primarily measuring and benchmarking and making decisions based on a very narrow range of metrics. To achieve a revolution in values, we need to rethink our measures of progress as a society. We are judging the performance of our governments and societies largely on the basis of measures like the gross domestic product, GDP. While GDP is a good indicator of our industrial output, it says almost nothing about the elements of life that underpin our belonging. These elements include social trust and connection, environmental quality, cultural preservation, education, economic mobility, agency, happiness, fulfillment, and joy. GDP rises as you cut down forests or community child care is outsourced to paid services. In short, GDP often rises as our experience of belonging declines. So here's a radical proposition. What if we tried to measure our living standards not in terms of industrial output, but rather in terms of belonging? Imagine if we measured our society's progress as our shared well-being and resilience. Imagine if we measured our material lives not just on what we deposit in our individual bank accounts, but rather what we deposit in our collective bank of resilience. In these days ahead, we will envision what it could look like to have an economic system built on the value of belonging. I know all of this might sound a wee bit idealistic. The right to belong, a global charter, new economic systems that bolster our well-being and resilience. These are all bold ideas that might sound implausible in an age of so much fear and division. But here's the thing. This work is already happening in the world right now. If you want proof, simply look around this room. In the coming days, we will hear from a doctor who has revolutionized mental health care in Zimbabwe by empowering grandmothers to restore connection and rootedness through free talk therapy on park benches. We will hear from former refugees who were forced to flee their homes and are now some of the most passionate and skillful advocates for building belonging on the global stage. We will hear from Indigenous leaders who are restoring connection to culture and nature after generations of separation. We will hear from athletes who overcame unthinkable obstacles of poverty or prejudice to empower isolated and marginalized people to find their agency. We will hear from political and economic and legal thinkers who are challenging the existing structures of authority to build belonging at the scale of real and practical ways. We will hear about new ways of measuring multidimensional poverty that takes into account not only income, but every aspect of well-being for a full life. We'll get to know the stories of skillful and inspired change makers from every imaginable background. We'll also, each one of us, get to show our stories. to show those and share those on how we're building the right to belong. I recently heard a teaching from a wise elder. It's just a few words that describe the essence of this movement that I'm talking about here. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Zen Buddhist master, a monk and an activist, someone who has been engaged in both spiritual and political work for almost a century. He was beloved by Martin Luther King for his nonviolent resistance in Vietnam. He's brought strength and solace to millions of people through his writings and retreats, all in his way of gentleness and humility. The teaching is phrased within the particular language of Buddhism, and yet it has a powerful message about our shared quest as human beings in the 21st century. He said, "The next Buddha is a Sangha." This means that the next enlightened one will not be in one individual person, but rather a whole community of people. The illuminated hero who will save us is not some powerful or eloquent leader or some wealthy technocratic institution. It is all of us together in a spirit of respect, recognition, and reciprocity. It's all of us, defined not by competition or material wealth, but rather in connection and rootedness. The solution to the seemingly intractable problems of this age is restoring our shared belonging. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing your stories and your insights and your hopes in the days to come. Thank you.